The great question: imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the very structure that once gave your life a sense of stability has dissolved into thin air. The job that once kept you moving forward feels hollow, your achievements appear strangely weightless, and even the values that once anchored your identity seem suspiciously arbitrary. You look around at the world, buzzing with activity, people rushing to work, chasing goals, buying, selling, scrolling, speaking, but suddenly it all feels like theater. You catch yourself whispering, "What is all of this for?" The strange thing is not that you asked the question, but that the moment you asked, you noticed how few people ever dare to. Most seem to live as though the script is already written, as though meaning is something external, handed down by tradition, society, or the invisible hands of culture. Yet here you are, at the edge of an abyss, realizing that the script may not exist at all. Nietzsche warned of this abyss long before modern life seemed to stumble into it. He described it not simply as an individual crisis but as a cultural fate. God is dead, he declared, not as a celebration, but as an observation that the collective structures of meaning that held Europe together for centuries were eroding. For him, the death of God wasn't about theology, it was about the collapse of belief itself, the vanishing of certainty, the unraveling of shared purpose. And he feared what would happen to humanity once we could no longer lean on external justifications for why we live. Imagine being handed absolute freedom, yet finding yourself paralyzed by it, burdened with the terrifying responsibility of creating meaning in a world where none is given. The paradox is unsettling. Freedom without direction feels like imprisonment. Power without purpose feels like weakness. Choice without values feels like chaos. Nietzsche anticipated that people, unable to face this emptiness, would retreat into distractions, ideologies, or mass conformity. And as you look around today, you might feel an uncanny recognition of his prophecy. Why do so many chase status symbols with desperate urgency? Why do we cling to political tribes, consumer identities, or the endless noise of entertainment? Could it be that these are substitutes, masks covering the raw wound of meaninglessness? Consider this: if meaning is not inherent in the universe, then everything, every ambition, every sacrifice, every joy, ultimately rests on nothing. Does that realization liberate you, or does it terrify you? Some argue that without ultimate meaning, life loses its worth. Others insist that only when the false scaffolding collapses can we build something truly our own. But what if both are true? What if the death of old meaning is both a devastating loss and a necessary birth? Here lies the contradiction: to fully live, you must face the fact that life has no ready-made purpose. Yet to face that truth directly is to risk despair, nihilism, and paralysis. How do you step into freedom without falling into emptiness? Nietzsche framed this tension as one of the most urgent challenges of human existence. He warned that a world without meaning could collapse into nihilism, a spiritual sickness where nothing matters and all striving feels absurd. And yet, paradoxically, he also suggested that this very collapse could clear the ground for something greater, the rise of individuals strong enough to create their own values, their own purpose, their own art of living. You, standing here in this imagined morning of disillusionment, are already caught in that tension. Do you cling to familiar illusions, or do you dare to walk into the unknown? Can you resist the temptation to numb yourself with distractions and instead confront the raw real ity of freedom? These questions are not abstract philosophy. They press against your own life. Look closely: how many of your daily routines, your choices, your goals are truly yours, and how many are borrowed scripts handed down by society? As the morning stretches on and you look into the mirror, you see not only your reflection but the faint shadow of Nietzsche's warning: a life without meaning is not a void you can ignore, it is a storm that quietly erodes everything from within. And yet, within this storm lies the seed of something extraordinary, if only you dare to find it. So here is the great question, the one that has haunted philosophers, poets, and seekers for centuries: in a world where meaning is not given, how do you live without falling into despair? Is it possible to turn emptiness into creation, or is the abyss destined to swallow us whole? The answer is not immediate, and perhaps it never comes fully formed. But to even begin searching is to awaken, and once awake, you cannot easily return to sleep. The stage is now set, to understand why this problem exists, and how it has quietly shaped the human mind. We must descend deeper, into the hidden roots of psychology, philosophy, and the shadows of culture itself. The hidden problem: its psychological/philosophical roots. If the collapse of external meaning feels like an abyss, then it is worth asking, why does this abyss exist in the first place? Why has modern humanity arrived at this peculiar moment where so much is possible, yet so little feels purposeful? To answer, we must trace the hidden currents that have shaped both our psyche and our civilization, currents Nietzsche saw more clearly than most. He believed the death of God was not the event itself but the symptom of a deeper unraveling. For centuries, belief systems, religious, cultural, moral, gave structure to human life. They told people who they were, what was good, and what the future held. With the Enlightenment, science, and the ratio NAL dismantling of traditional metaphysics, those grand narratives lost their authority. Humanity had reason, but no longer faith. We had knowledge, but no longer certainty. In this sense, Nietzsche saw modern man as an orphan, left to wander without the comfort of a cosmic parent. Psychologically, this shift is profound. Carl Jung later argued that every individual carries a deep need for meaning, and when collective structures collapse, the psyche is flooded with chaos. Without myths and symbols to guide us, the unconscious fills the void with shadows, impulses, fears, and unacknowledged drives. The hidden problem is not simply that meaning disappeared, but that in its absence we are vulnerable to substitutes. Consumerism, nationalism, addiction, ideology, all are modern idols, filling the void left by the old gods. But unlike the myths that once connected us to archetypal truths, these substitutes often fragment us further, leaving us emptier the more we pursue them. Arthur Schopenhauer, before Nietzsche, painted an even darker picture. He argued that life is driven by a blind, insatiable force, the will, to survive, to reproduce, to strive endlessly. For Schopenhauer, happiness is always fleeting because the will never rests. Satisfaction only breeds new desire, and thus suffering is constant. Nietzsche both admired and resisted Schopenhauer's pessimism. He agreed that existence is inherently painful and absurd, but he believed despair was not the end point. Instead, the challenge was to face suffering directly and still affirm life. Yet how many of us manage to do this? Most escape into distraction, fleeing from the confrontation with the absurd. Here lies the hidden problem at its psychological root. The human mind craves stability, but the world offers none. Viktor Frankl, reflecting on his survival in concentration camps, observed that those who endured suffering most resiliently were those who found meaning within it. He argued that humans can survive almost anything if they believe their suffering serves a purpose. Yet, in a society where grand purposes have dissolved, we are left in a dangerous vacuum. The psyche, deprived of stable meaning, clings to shallow replacements, workaholism, compulsive entertainment, even toxic relationships, anything that dulls the terror of the abyss. But the philosophical roots stretch even deeper. Nietzsche feared that without strong values, societies would drift toward nihilism. And in nihilism lies a subtle paradox: if nothing matters, then why bother resisting? Why not embrace conformity, comfort, mediocrity? In fact, Nietzsche saw modern democracy, industrialization, and the rise of mass culture as both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, freedom expanded, on the other, individuality weakened. When everyone seeks safety in numbers, the strength to create one's own path erodes. The last man, as Nietzsche called him, is a being who avoids pain, risk, and depth, preferring comfort over greatness. He survives, but without passion or creativity. He is content, but only because he has lowered his expectations of what life can be. Look around today. Are we not surrounded by echoes of the last man? Infinite entertainment at our fingertips, constant validation through social media, yet rising rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. We have conquered disease and hunger to a degree once unimaginable, yet many find themselves paralyzed by emptiness. Why? Because survival alone is not enough. The human spirit, Nietzsche insisted, needs challenge, creation, and self-overcoming. When those are absent, the hidden problem surfaces as quiet despair. Jean-Paul Sartre pushed this diagnosis further. He argued that in a world without an here, meaning, we are condemned to freedom. Condemned, because freedom feels like a burden when no one else dictates your path. Every choice is yours, and with that choice comes responsibility. To avoid this weight, people often engage in what Sartre called bad faith, convincing themselves they are powerless, hiding behind roles or excuses. I have no choice, we say, though in truth we are avoiding choice. The hidden problem, then, is not only cultural or psychological, it is existential. It is the tension between our desire for meaning and our inability to find it ready-made. And so the problem deepens. Nietzsche's warning was not merely about theology or culture, it was about the fragility of the human spirit when confronted with a universe that does not care. What happens when a being designed to seek purpose discovers there is none written into the cosmos? For some, it is despair. For others, it is denial. And for a rare few, it is the beginning of transformation. But before transformation can come, one must first fully feel the weight of the abyss, without running from it. Here, perhaps, is why Nietzsche still unsettles us. He does not offer comforting answers. He does not point back to tradition or forward to some guaranteed utopia. Instead, he demands that we hold the contradiction in our own hands. Life has no inherent meaning, and yet it is your task to live as though it does. To create meaning where none exists, to say, yes, even to suffering, to dance on the edge of the abyss without falling into it. And yet, most of us do not dance. We cling to the rails of conformity, terrified of falling. But the cost of that clinging is high, for while we avoid the abyss, we also avoid the possibility of greatness. The hidden problem, then, is not simply that life has no inherent meaning. It is that most people cannot bear this truth, and so they waste their lives fleeing it. But what happens when we fail to confront the abyss? What unseen consequences arise when individuals, societies, and entire cultures avoid this confrontation? The consequences are not always dramatic or immediate. They creep in quietly, shaping behaviors, distorting values, and hollowing out lives. And it is to these consequences we must now turn. The unseen consequences, the most dangerous forces in life, are often those that work invisibly, shaping us not with sudden shocks but with slow, quiet erosion. The absence of meaning is one of those forces. It rarely announces itself directly, instead, it seeps into routines, distorts values, and whispers into decisions until whole lives are guided by currents few ever recognize. Nietzsche's warning was not only that people would lose their sense of divine or universal purpose, but that in the vacuum left behind, new, subtler chains would emerge. Chains of conformity, consumption, distraction, forms of enslavement that masquerade as freedom. And the consequences of this masquerade can be seen in both the individual psyche and the larger structures of society. At the personal level, the first consequence of living in a world stripped of inherent meaning is the rise of quiet despair. Unlike the dramatic despair of tragedy, this one is silent, disguised beneath layers of busyness. People rush to work, chase careers, accumulate possessions, and entertain themselves endlessly, but beneath it all lingers a restless anxiety. Why does the achievement never feel enough? Why does comfort so quickly sour into boredom? Psychologists describe this as the hedonic treadmill, the phenomenon where every gain only resets our expectations, forcing us to run harder for the same fleeting satisfaction. But beneath this treadmill lies something deeper. If life lacks inherent purpose, then every milestone achieved feels strangely hollow once reached. The promotion, the house, the recognition, all are celebrated, but the celebration fades, leaving an unspoken emptiness. This cycle repeats until one day, the person no longer even expects fulfillment, settling instead for distraction. Distraction, then, becomes the second great consequence. In Nietzsche's time, it was religion, nationalism, and emerging mass culture. Today, it is an endless stream of notifications, entertainment, and digital escape. Smartphones, social media, and consumer algorithms have perfected the art of numbing. They provide an illusion of engagement while subtly preventing us from confronting deeper questions. After all, if the abyss terrifies us, why look into it when a glowing screen offers instant comfort? Yet the cost is profound. Every moment spent in shallow distraction is a moment not spent in authentic reflection, creation, or growth. And slowly, the ability to sit with silence, to wrestle with the big questions, atrophies. The abyss doesn't disappear, it only waits, growing larger the longer it is ignored. But distraction does not only numb, it also shapes. The constant bombardment of consumer ideals teaches us to equate meaning with consumption. You are what you buy. Happiness becomes a product, identity becomes a brand, and freedom is reduced to the ability to choose between commodities. Here Nietzsche's prophecy of the last man is realized in disturbing clarity, a person who desires nothing beyond comfort, who avoids suffering at all costs, and who lives without ever asking why. This is not freedom, it is domestication. And the consequence is a widespread cultural mediocrity, a flattening of human potential into predictable patterns of consumption and distraction. At the societal level, the absence of meaning breeds even darker consequences. When individuals no longer find purpose within themselves, they become vulnerable to external authorities who promise it. History is filled with examples: authoritarian movements, cults, radical ideologies, all thrive on peoples who hunger for meaning. Nietzsche feared this too. When the old gods died, he worried that people would turn not to creativity but to fanaticism. A society starved of authentic meaning becomes fertile ground for manipulation, because to the lost, even a destructive ideology feels better than emptiness. The 20th century bore grim testimony to this warning, with entire populations swept into movements that offered certainty at the cost of freedom and humanity. And even today, the resurgence of extreme polarizations, whether political or cultural, reveals the same hunger. People want a story to belong to, a purpose to animate their lives, even if it means surrendering their individuality to a collective illusion. There are also subtler consequences, those rooted in psychology but magnified by culture. One is addiction. Gabor Mate, writing on the psychology of addiction, argues that at its core, addiction is not about drugs or substances but about the attempt to soothe deep existential pain. In a world without meaning, addiction becomes a natural response, a desperate attempt to escape the void. Whether through alcohol, drugs, gambling, or even socially acceptable addictions like work and technology, people seek to numb the discomfort of meaninglessness. Yet this escape, like all distractions, only deepens the problem, leaving individuals more fractured, more dependent, and further from authentic purpose. Another consequence is the rise of collective anxiety and depression. Studies consistently show that societies with strong communal beliefs and clear traditions tend to have lower rates of existential despair. In contrast, highly individualistic societies, where meaning is privatized and no longer collectively shared, see higher rates of mental illness. The irony is striking: modernity promised freedom, but without shared structures of meaning, that freedom has become isolation. Individuals are told they are free to create their own lives, yet many are paralyzed by the sheer weight of the task. Without guidance, freedom can feel like chaos, and chaos breeds despair. The final unseen consequence may be the most devastating: the quiet erosion of greatness. Nietzsche believed that human life, at its highest, was capable of art, creativity, and transformation. But when confronted with the abyss, most people choose comfort instead of creation, conformity instead of courage. The result is not catastrophic collapse but mediocrity. People survive but do not thrive, exist but do not live. They avoid pain but also joy, avoid risk but also depth. And slowly, societies built on this avoidance become shallow, producing fewer visionaries, fewer creators, fewer individuals willing to challenge the norms. What is lost is not only individual fulfillment but the collective brilliance of humanity itself. The consequences of avoiding meaning, then, are not abstract, they are lived daily, in the quiet despair of individuals, the addictive cycles of societies, and the mediocrity of cultures. Nietzsche's warning rings louder with every generation: a world without meaning does not remain neutral. It breeds distractions, addictions, mediocrity, and, in the worst cases, fanaticism. And yet, even in this grim picture, there lies a possibility. For if the abyss can destroy, it can also awaken. If the collapse of old meanings can enslave, it can also liberate. The consequences are real and dangerous, but they also set the stage for something radical, the possibility of rebellion, of breaking free. The question, then, is simple but urgent: if the unseen consequences of meaninglessness are shaping our lives, how do we resist? How do we step off the treadmill, break through distraction, and confront the abyss with courage instead of denial? To answer, we must now turn to rebellion, not the rebellion of violence or anger, but the rebellion of creation, the act of forging one's own path in the sense of certainty. The rebellion, how to break free. Rebellion in Nietzsche's sense is not about storming palaces or burning institutions, it is something far more intimate, dangerous, and transformative. It is the rebellion of an individual who refuses to be lulled into the stupor of mediocrity, who dares to confront the abyss of meaninglessness without retreating into distraction or conformity. To break free, you must first recognize that no savior, no system, no ideology will hand you purpose. The rebellion begins the moment you accept the terrifying truth that meaning is not discovered, it is created. And in this act of creation lies both the risk of despair and the possibility of greatness. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast desert. There are no roads, no maps, no guides. Most people retreat to the city behind them, with its crowded streets of conformity and shallow pleasures. But rebellion demands you step forward into the desert, alone, to carve your own path. This is why Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch, the overman, not as a biological evolution but as a psychological and spiritual one. The Übermensch is the human who, faced with the collapse of external meaning, invents new values, new purposes, and lives as a creator rather than a passive consumer of ready-made truths. To rebel, then, is to live as though you are both the sculptor and the clay of your own existence. How does this rebellion begin? Paradoxically, with stillness. Instead of drowning in distractions, you must allow silence to return. Only in silence can you hear the voice of your own desires, fears, and unfulfilled longings. Carl Jung suggested that much of our suffering comes from repressing the shadow, those parts of ourselves we deny or ignore because they feel dark, unacceptable, or painful. Yet to deny the shadow is to remain fragmented, incomplete. Rebellion demands shadow work, confronting your fears, your envy, your hidden rage, your secret weaknesses, not to be consumed by them but to integrate them. For it is only when the whole of he self is embraced that genuine creation becomes possible. But rebellion is not purely inward. It is expressed through the choices you make daily, the small refusals and the daring affirmations. Consider how society rewards conformity, working jobs you hate for prestige, chasing possessions you don't need for validation, engaging in endless noise to avoid silence. Rebellion means questioning each of these habits. Why am I doing this? Who benefits from this pursuit? Does this reflect my deepest values or merely someone else's script? Sartre would call this reclaiming authenticity, refusing to live in bad faith. Every act of authenticity, no matter how small, is an act of rebellion against nihilism. And yet, rebellion is not a rejection of suffering but an embrace of it. Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, the love of fate, embodies this radical stance. To break free is not to avoid pain but to affirm it, to say yes to life even in its cruelty. Imagine taking your worst struggles, your deepest losses, your most painful memories, and instead of wishing them away, declaring, "I would choose this again, because it made me who I am." This is not passive acceptance, it is active transformation. It turns suffering into raw material for strength, emptiness into a canvas for creation. To rebel is to stop running from pain and instead weave it into the tapestry of meaning you craft for yourself. History is filled with examples of such rebels. Dostoevsky, imprisoned and condemned to death, found in his suffering the raw insight that fueled his novels. Viktor Frankl, enduring the concentration camps, discovered that even in horror, one could choose to find purpose in endurance and compassion. Nietzsche himself, plagued by illness and isolation, transmuted his suffering into philosophy that still provokes and awakens minds today. What unites these figures is not that they escaped suffering, but that they used it as fuel for creation. Their rebellion was not against pain but against meaninglessness. On a practical level, breaking free demands daily courage. It may mean pursuing a creative passion that defies social expectations, refusing to measure your worth by money or status, or seeking relationships built not on convenience but on truth. It may mean walking away from distractions that dull your mind, choosing silence over noise, or confronting fears you have long buried. Every time you act in alignment with your authentic self, you rebel against the cultural machinery that thrives on conformity. But rebellion also requires vision. Without vision, rebellion becomes mere resistance. To break free is not just to reject what is hollow but to build what is alive. Nietzsche believed the highest act of the human spirit was not destruction but creation. What values could you create if none were given? What art could you birth, what purpose could you live, if you dared to stop asking for permission? The true rebel does not remain forever at war with society or despair, they eventually outgrow both, turning their energy towards shaping something new. Still, rebellion is not without danger. Many collapse under the weight of freedom, turning their rebellion into cynicism, nihilism, or isolation. Some become consumed by their shadow, mistaking destruction for creation. Others lose themselves in endless questioning, paralyzed by choices. To truly break free requires not only courage but discipline, the ability to choose, to commit, to build without guarantee. Freedom without responsibility becomes chaos, rebellion without creation becomes emptiness. And so, the path of rebellion is narrow but luminous. It requires courage to face the abyss, strength to resist distractions, humility to confront your shadow, and audacity to create meaning where none exists. It is not easy, but then again, greatness never is. Nietzsche's challenge was not for the faint of heart, it was for those willing to dance on the edge of the abyss and call it life. Yet even rebellion is not the final step. For while it frees you from conformity and awakens your creative power, there remains a deeper truth still hidden, one that transcends rebellion itself. Beyond the abyss, beyond suffering, beyond even the act of creating meaning, lies an ultimate realization, a truth so profound that it reframes the entire struggle. To uncover this truth, we must move into the final stage of the journey, the ultimate revelation of what it means to live in a world without meaning, and yet to live fully. Beyond the abyss, beyond suffering, beyond even the act of creating meaning, lies an ultimate realization, a truth so profound that it reframes the entire struggle. To uncover this truth, we must move into the final stage of the journey, the ultimate revelation of what it means to live in a world without meaning, and yet to live fully. At this stage, the illusions have fallen away, rebellion has exhausted itself, and the temptation of despair has been faced and overcome. What remains is a stark and quiet recognition that the world itself is neither for us nor against us, it is indifferent, vast, and unyielding, and yet, paradoxically, it is within this very indifference that the possibility of authentic life is found. For when we finally accept that existence carries no inherent purpose, we are liberated not only from external expectations but from the last remnants of our own craving for absolute answers. We cease to demand from life what it cannot give, and in this renunciation, we discover something more enduring than all illusions, the freedom to live without justification. This is the moment where solitude no longer feels like exile but becomes the natural condition of being. The silence that once tormented now feels like a vast openness, And in that openness, we realize that existence, stripped bare of illusions, is not a void to be feared but a canvas too infinite to ever be fully filled. Life without meaning does not signify emptiness, it signifies possibility. Meaning is not discovered, it is created, yes, but even deeper than creation is a serenity born from no longer needing to create anything at all to justify one's being. One begins to live in alignment with what Schopenhauer glimpsed in flashes but perhaps never fully accepted, that the will itself, the blind striving that animates us, can be transcended not through its indulgence but through its quiet cessation. To live fully in a world without meaning is not to rage endlessly against its silence, nor to construct fragile systems of belief to cover the abyss, but to embrace the abyss as it is, to walk into its darkness without flinching and to stand there, calm and unshaken, as the stars look on with their cold brilliance. And in that act of acceptance, one finds a joy unlike any other, a joy not dependent on outcomes, not tied to illusions, not shattered by loss, but steady, enduring, and strangely luminous. It is the joy of being itself, the quiet affirmation of life in its barest form. To be here, now, breathing, aware, without needing more, that is enough. It is not resignation but liberation, for once the demand for ultimate meaning dissolves, every small act of existence shines with a new clarity. The simple sip of water, the feel of sunlight on the skin, the sight of leaves trembling in the wind, these become not distractions from some higher purpose but life itself, fully lived. In this final stage, solitude is no longer a burden but a homecoming. The one who endures the path of despair, rebellion, and creative assertion arrives not at emptiness but at simplicity, at a profound intimacy with the present moment. Schopenhauer might call it the suspension of the will, others might call it awakening. Names matter little, for the expiry. NCE itself transcends them. What matters is that in this state, one no longer seeks to escape the world or to justify it but simply to live it. The ultimate revelation, then, is this: life needs no meaning to be lived beautifully. Existence itself, raw and unadorned, is already enough. To realize this is to be free, not free in the shallow sense of doing whatever one wishes, but free in the deeper sense of no longer being enslaved by the endless hunger for why. The chains fall away not because the universe gives us an answer, but because we no longer demand one. We become like wanderers who, having sought the distant horizon, discover that the horizon was never a destination but a perspective, and that the ground beneath their feet was always the true place of arrival. And so the journey ends not in despair, not in rebellion, not in frantic creation, but in quiet affirmation. The silence remains, but it is no longer hostile, it has become a companion. The solitude remains, but it no longer isolates, it reveals our kinship with all that is. The world remains indifferent, but we no longer need its approval. In this state, even suffering takes on a new light, not something to be eliminated, not something to be glorified, but simply part of the texture of being, woven into the same fabric as joy. To suffer and to rejoice, to lose and to find, to love and to grieve, all these are no longer opposites to be resolved but movements within the same dance. And when the dance is accepted for what it is, one finds a peace so complete that even the question of meaning dissolves. It is not that the question has been answered, it is that it no longer matters. The abyss remains, but one smiles into it. The night remains, but one walks it with untroubled steps. And in that final silence, beyond illusions, beyond rebellion, beyond creation itself, one discovers the most radical truth of that life, precisely because it has no meaning, is the most precious of gifts.